Somewhere in the eastern reaches of the Tibetan Plateau, in a canyon so deep and so remote that most maps barely bother to draw it accurately, engineers are building something that will generate more electricity every single year than the entire United Kingdom uses. Not a city, not a region, an entire country with 68 million people in it, running on electricity from one river bend in Tibet. And that number, 300 billion kilowatt hours a year, isn't even the most staggering figure attached to this project. That title belongs to the price tag, somewhere north of $170 billion, making it, by most estimates, the single most expensive piece of infrastructure ever built by human beings. This is the Yarlung Changpo hydropower project. And if you haven't heard of it yet, you're about to understand why the governments of two nuclear-armed nations are watching its construction with something close to alarm. Here's what's actually at stake. China isn't just building a big dam, it's building 5 dams in a cascade down one of the steepest and most dramatic river drops on the planet, a location where the Yarlung Changpo River falls 2,000 meters in elevation over just 50 kilometers of canyon. To put that in perspective, that's a drop steeper than almost anywhere else a major river exists anywhere on Earth, concentrated into a stretch of gorge so extreme it's sometimes called the world's deepest canyon. When you have that much water falling that far, that fast, you have an almost unbelievable amount of untapped energy just sitting there, waiting for someone with enough money, enough engineering ambition, and frankly, enough disregard for the difficulty of the terrain to go and capture it. China decided it would be that someone. But here's the twist that turns this from an engineering story into a geopolitical one. That same river, the one China is about to dam 5 times over, doesn't stay in China. It crosses the border into India, where it's known by a different name, the Brahmaputra. And from there it flows on into Bangladesh before finally reaching the Bay of Bengal. 30%, maybe more, of the water that fills the Brahmaputra as it crosses through India's Arunachal Pradesh and Assam originates upstream in exactly the stretch of river China is now damming. And nearly 2/3 of Bangladesh's entire water supply traces back to that same river system. So when China builds the largest hydropower complex in human history at the headwaters, it isn't just an engineering decision inside its own borders. It's a decision that touches the water security of well over 1 billion people who live downstream in 2 countries that have no say in how the project is built, operated, or one day, potentially, controlled. That's the tension driving this entire story, and we're going to walk through all of it. How China actually plans to pull this off, why the number 300 billion kilowatt hours matters so much, and why India and Bangladesh are so worried they've started building their own countermeasure dams in response. But to understand where this is going, you first need to understand how we got here, because this project has been sitting in the planning stages, quietly for the better part of 2 decades. Now let's start with the basics of what's actually being built. The project is officially based near Ningxi in the Tibet Autonomous Region, at a stretch of the Yarlung Tsangpo known as the Great Bend, the point where this river makes a dramatic hairpin turn around a mountain called Namcha Barwa before plunging south toward the Indian border. This isn't a single wall of concrete like the Three Gorges Dam further east in China. It's a cascade of 5 separate power stations, strung down the length of that steep canyon, each one capturing a portion of the river's descent. Chinese state media has described the total investment at roughly 1.2 trillion yuan, which converts to somewhere in the range of $170 billion, depending on the exchange rate you use and the day you check it. Either way, it dwarfs the cost of the Three Gorges Dam, dwarfs the cost of most national infrastructure budgets, and makes this arguably the most expensive single construction project ever attempted by any government, anywhere in recorded history. The numbers on output are just as extreme. When complete, the cascade is expected to generate around 60 gigawatts of capacity and roughly 300 billion kilowatt hours of electricity every year. For comparison, the Three Gorges Dam, which has held the title of the world's largest power station for roughly 2 decades, produces somewhere around 100 billion kilowatt hours annually. This new project is targeting triple that. It's not an incremental upgrade to China's hydropower ambitions. It's an attempt to build something in an entirely different category, a project so large that Chinese officials have taken to calling it, without much apparent irony, the project of the century. Construction officially began in July of 2025, and if the current timeline holds, the first phases are expected to come online by around 2030. Though, for a project of this scale, in terrain this difficult, timelines have a well-documented habit of slipping. Now, here's something interesting about how China chose to manage a project this large. It didn't hand it to an existing state utility. Instead, the government created an entirely new state-owned enterprise, specifically to build and operate this one dam complex. It's called China Yajiang Group, and its sole reason for existing is this project. When a government spins up a brand new company, purely to manage a single piece of infrastructure that tells you something about how seriously it's treating both the opportunity and the difficulty involved. This isn't being bolted onto an existing agency's to-do list. It has its own dedicated corporate structure, its own leadership, and presumably its own budget lines, answerable directly to Beijing. So why go through all this trouble? Why build in one of the most remote, seismically unstable, and diplomatically sensitive locations on the planet at a cost that would make most national governments blink? The answer comes down to a strategy China has been pursuing for years, often described as west-to-east power transmission. China's population and industrial base are concentrated in the east, cities like Shanghai, Guangzhou, and the manufacturing corridors that keep its export economy running. But a huge amount of the country's natural energy potential, hydropower in awe, mountainous terrain, solar in its western deserts, sits thousands of kilometers away in the west. For years now, China has been building ultra-high voltage transmission lines specifically to move electricity across that distance efficiently, essentially building a national grid designed to funnel remote energy toward its industrial heartland. This dam slots directly into that strategy. Very little of the power it generates is intended to stay in Tibet for local use. Instead, it's designed to be sent east through those same ultra-high voltage corridors to feed the industrial centers that are the actual engine of China's economy. There are also reports suggesting a portion of the output may eventually be sold to Myanmar, extending China's energy influence beyond its own borders entirely. This is where the project starts to reveal its full ambition. It isn't just a power station, it's a piece of national energy infrastructure engineered to move electricity from one of the emptiest corners of China to some of its most crowded ones, at a scale that reshapes the country's entire energy map. But building anything at this scale, in this location, comes with problems that money alone can't solve. And this is where the story gets complicated. The Great Bend of the Yarlung Changpo sits almost directly on top of the tectonic boundary where the Indian plate is still, to this day, slowly grinding underneath the Eurasian plate. The same collision that pushed up the Himalayas in the first place, and continues to make this one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. Earthquakes here aren't a rare, once-in-a-generation risk. They're a recurring feature of the landscape. Landslides are common. The terrain is steep enough and unstable enough that even routine construction work carries meaningful risk, let alone building 5 interconnected dam structures designed to hold back and redirect one of Asia's largest rivers. Chinese officials have stated that the project underwent extensive scientific evaluation before approval, specifically examining geological stability alongside environmental and downstream water rights concerns. Officially, the project was delayed for a period specifically so those evaluations could take place before finally receiving government approval in December of 2024. Whether those evaluations are sufficient to manage the seismic risk over the operational lifetime of the dam is something outside observers, particularly in neighboring countries, remain openly skeptical about, for a fairly obvious reason. If a structure of this scale were to fail, whether from an earthquake, a landslide, or some combination of both, the flood risk downstream wouldn't be a local disaster. It would be a transboundary one, hitting communities in India and Bangladesh who had no role whatsoever in approving, designing, or building the thing that failed. And that brings us to the part of this story that turns it from an engineering marvel into a geopolitical flashpoint. Downstream, in India, the Yarlung Tsangpo becomes the Siang River as it enters Arunachal Pradesh, before eventually becoming the Brahmaputra as it widens through Assam. From there, it crosses into Bangladesh, where it merges with other major rivers before emptying into the Bay of Bengal. This isn't a minor tributary. The Brahmaputra is one of the largest rivers in South Asia, and it has shaped the agriculture, the economy, and frankly, the entire cultural history of the communities along its banks for thousands of years. Estimates suggest that Brahmaputra supplies roughly 2/3 of Bangladesh's total water needs. For India's northeastern states, it's just as central, irrigating farmland, sustaining fisheries, and functioning as one of the primary water sources for a region home to tens of millions of people. So, when a foreign government with no formal water-sharing treaty in place begins constructing the largest hydropower complex in human history at that river's headwaters, the downstream reaction is not exactly surprising. India's concerns center on 2 connected fears. The first is straightforward: control. A dam system capable of holding back and releasing water at this scale gives China, at least in theory, the ability to influence how much water reaches India during both the dry season and the monsoon. Indian officials and analysts have raised the possibility, publicly, not as some fringe conspiracy theory, that in a moment of serious diplomatic tension, China could restrict flow during dry months, worsening water scarcity in India's northeast, or release large volumes suddenly during the monsoon, intensifying flooding downstream. This is sometimes referred to, a little dramatically but not inaccurately, as the weaponization of water. Whether China would ever actually do this is a separate question from whether it now has the physical capacity to do it, and capacity alone is enough to change the strategic calculus in New Delhi. The second concern is sediment. The Brahmaputra is one of the most sediment-rich rivers on the planet, and that sediment isn't incidental. It's the reason the delta downstream, including Bangladesh's agricultural heartland and the vast Sundarbans mangrove forest, exists in its current fertile form at all. Large dams are notoriously effective at trapping sediment upstream, which means water that continues to flow downstream past a dam often carries a fraction of the sediment it once did. Over years and decades, that can degrade farmland productivity, accelerate coastal erosion, and threaten ecosystems that took millennia to form. The Sundarbans, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, spanning both Indian and Bangladeshi territory, is considered particularly vulnerable to exactly this kind of slow, sediment-starved decline. China's official position on all of this is that the project is what's called a run-of-river scheme, meaning, in theory, that it's designed to generate power by using the river's natural flow, rather than significantly damming and holding back large volumes of water for extended periods. Chinese officials have repeatedly assured both India and Bangladesh that the project poses no threat to downstream water availability, and that it was approved only after what they describe as decades of peer-reviewed research into exactly these environmental and geopolitical questions. This is the reversal in this story. The point where a dam that sounds, on paper, like a clean, ambitious, clean energy triumph starts to look considerably messier the moment you follow the river past the Chinese border. China frames this as a modernization project and a clean energy milestone. Downstream, it's viewed as an unresolved and potentially destabilizing question mark hanging over the water security of well over 1 billion people, and the responses from India and Bangladesh haven't been passive. Bangladesh formally requested detailed information about the project back in February of 2025, and by most accounts, received little in the way of a substantive official response. Later, during a visit by Bangladesh's interim leader to Beijing, the two countries reaffirmed existing arrangements around sharing hydrological data. A modest step, but a far cry from a binding water-sharing agreement covering a project of this magnitude. India's response has been more assertive. Rather than relying solely on diplomatic pressure, India has moved forward with plans for its own major dam on the same river system, just across the border in Arunachal Pradesh. The proposed Siang project would be India's largest hydropower facility, with a targeted capacity in the range of 10 to 11.5 gigawatts. Publicly, it's framed as a straightforward energy and water security project, but regional analysts have been fairly candid that it also serves a second, more strategic purpose, giving India its own reservoir capacity to buffer against sudden changes in flow from upstream, whether caused by flood releases or dry season restrictions from the Chinese project. In effect, India is building a countermeasure disguised as an infrastructure project of its own, betting that having reservoir capacity on its own side of the border is the most reliable insurance policy against whatever happens upstream. There's also a domestic dimension to this story that gets far less coverage internationally, and it's worth pausing on. The dam sits in Tibetan territory, and its construction directly affects Tibetan communities who have lived along this river for generations, in some cases regarding it as culturally and spiritually significant. Reports around the project's inauguration suggest that local Tibetan participation in the planning process was largely symbolic rather than substantive, and that towns and historically significant sites in the flooding zone face submersion with limited consultation. Combine that with the fact that the electricity being generated is destined almost entirely for consumption thousands of kilometers away in eastern China, and you get a familiar pattern seen in large infrastructure projects worldwide. The communities closest to the disruption bear the cost, while the benefits flow outward to populations who will likely never see the dam, the canyon, or the communities it displaced. If you're the kind of person who wants the full picture on stories like this one, not just the headline about the world's biggest dam, but the geopolitics, the engineering, and the human cost sitting underneath it, that's exactly what this channel is built around. So go ahead and subscribe if you want to keep following how this plays out. So where does this actually leave us now that construction is genuinely underway and the diplomatic reactions are no longer hypothetical? Downstream nations that the project poses no threat to their water security, citing extensive internal review. India and Bangladesh, for their part, continue to push for greater transparency and, ideally, some kind of formal trilateral framework that would give them actual legal standing in how the river is managed going forward, rather than relying on Beijing's word alone. Neither side seems inclined to escalate this into open conflict. The economic and diplomatic relationships between these countries are simply too significant to risk over a single, however enormous, infrastructure project. But that doesn't mean the underlying tension disappears. It just moves underground into the kind of long-running strategic calculation that shapes regional relationships for decades. Reservoir capacity as leverage, water-sharing data as a bargaining chip, and a river that, once dammed at this scale, permanently changes the balance of power between the nations that depend on it. What makes this story worth watching isn't really the concrete or even the 60 gigawatts of capacity, impressive as those numbers are. It's the fact that China, once again, is demonstrating a particular kind of ambition, a willingness to build at a scale, in terrain, and at a cost that most nations would consider simply too difficult, too risky, or too diplomatically fraught to attempt. The Three Gorges Dam once held that title of audacious, record-breaking ambition. This project doesn't just match it. By most of the numbers that matter, output, cost, scale, it triples it. Whether that ambition ends up being remembered as a triumph of engineering or a case study in the risks of building unilaterally on a river that belongs, in every practical sense, to more than one nation, is a question that won't be answered for years. Construction is ongoing. The clock toward that 2030 target is already running. And